Okay, so hello, I'm Twyla, and I thank you for joining me. And I hope that you have mixed yourself a kitchen sink cocktail, which is quite strong. So I'll do my best to not slur my words as I talk about the Rhinocar tonight. But rather like the piece that we're discussing tonight, this cocktail has a little bit of everything kind of thrown together and sort of mixed up. So that's why we thought it to be an appropriate companion to the Rhinocar. And again, if you have any questions or comments as I'm speaking, feel free to enter them into the chat and I will respond to them as we go, or I'll also leave a few minutes at the end for question and answers. Okay, so this is our final cocktail with the Curator. We've had a series of 3 cocktails with the Curator, and we're ending today with David Best's Rhinocar, which is an all-time fan favorite of DeRosa goers. It's one of the most well-loved pieces in the collection, so that's why we thought it would be perhaps appropriate to highlight it tonight in our closing presentation. It's a humorous car or piece of sculpture that sits in the entryway of the exhibition, The Incorrect Museum, and it's this crazy kind of explosion of found objects that are affixed to a 1976 Oldsmobile. And I learned in my research for tonight that it was actually commissioned by Renee for inclusion in the collection from David Best in 1984. And this was only a few years into David Best's career as a maker of art cars. His first art car was commissioned around 1980 by the then young institution in San Francisco, the Exploratorium. So the Exploratorium commissioned his first art car, and this Rhinocar was commissioned by Renee shortly after in 1984. So in the 40 years since the Exploratorium first commissioned an art car from David Best, he's created a really large number of art cars, and including another car that's in the DeRosa's collection, Mother Tina's car, which is perhaps a little better known to people. But this is interesting as an early example of an art car by David Best. David Best is, of course, now best known for the work that he does in conjunction with the Burning Man festivals and for his temples that he constructs for Burning Man and other places too. So I hope at the end we can think together maybe a little bit about some connections between his work in the art car realm and how that connects to what he does with the temples and his involvement with Burning Man. Yeah. So I wanted to state by way of introduction that this car, even though it's such a well-loved and familiar piece to so many people, I think it's a little bit unclear in some ways sort of how it fits in with the rest of the collection, because it doesn't seem at first blush to have a lot of connection to some of the other artists that are in the collection, including Bruce Conner and some of the other better known artists that were working in the Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s. But what I want to try and emphasize and think about together tonight is how David Best's practices and his work is not really just separate from the stories that we all know about Bay Area art in the 60s and 70s, but that David Best is really like a creature of this kind of incorrect art world that existed in the Bay Area in the 60s and 70s. So I want to encourage us to try and think about David Best not as kind of a funny outlier in the collection, but to really kind of think about how he came out of this kind of incorrect universe that we look at in the exhibition. So I want to think about how his work connects to figures that we know, including Bruce Conner, Jay DeFeo, William Wiley, and others. So I think there are some unexpected points of connection that I hope to point us towards. Okay, so most of the images that I have tonight are these really great detail images of the car. And I wanted to say that, of course, the most famous aspect of this car is this huge rhino head that as the really dominant visual element. And he's also got a rhino behind in the back. But what I think is a little bit more interesting, and the kind of looking that I want us to do is a closer looking, and that if we look sort of beyond the more obvious visual element of the rhino stuff, that there's a lot of really beautiful, intricate kind of detail work going on that you have to really look closely to see and to understand. So rather than focusing on the rhino bit of the car, I want to look at the other more detailed visual elements. So this car, like all of the other art cars that he's done, is adorned with found objects that he sources from a dump in Petaluma. And he goes to the dump every day, and he has amassed this collection of crazy objects that he uses in the art car that he does. This is a top-down image that Hugo took, and so this is an vantage point that we don't normally get to see. You see, this is the back of the car. But I was really struck by this image when Hugo submitted it to me, and it kind of looks almost like a Diebenkorn kind of abstracted landscape a bit. Like it sort of looks like you're looking down from an airplane on a piece of land, I think. And in other ways, I think it's really an interesting visual composition. The colors are really beautiful, and the way the shapes go together. So I think that's really interesting, that when you kind of take a step back and look at the colors and the shapes, it's actually really a beautiful composition. And it's not kind of the crazy mess that it might at first appear to be. So when it struck me that this kind of looked a bit like a Diebenkorn landscape, I decided to look into a little bit into David Best's training, and he was in fact trained early in life as a painter in the Diebenkorn style, and he still does maintain a studio practice of painting and especially drawing in a really highly refined drawing technique that differs really obviously from the more kind of funky assemblage work that we're familiar with from him. So I think that's interesting. So the fact that he creates these kind of funky objects like this car that look like they're just a jumble and a mess is like an intentional choice on his part, because he's trained and has the eye of a painter or a draftsman who would do well in the traditional art market, but instead he chooses to create things that are kind of a little bit intentionally ugly or funky looking, like this car. But if you look at it from certain angles and in certain lights, you can see how well trained his eye is for forming compositions. And he's really well versed in art history, and particularly in the art history of the Bay Area. So, and he was trained at the Art Institute by lots of famous painters, including Clifford Still and Hassel Smith. So he was really steeped in this San Francisco arts community that we have been tracing in the exhibition, The Incorrect Museum. And he would have been, I believe, at the Art Institute around the same time as William Wiley and Robert Hudson and William Allen, maybe a few years later. Okay. So then another thing I wanted to mention about the sort of apparent mess of objects that adorns the car is that if you look a little bit more closely, I think in ways he is kind of trying to tell a story or make a point with the objects that he chooses. So it's not just a random mess, is part of what I wanted to say. So here we've highlighted a section of the car where he has collected a lot of instruments of war, including grenades and skulls. So this assemblage is in some way saying something about American militarism, I believe. He, Best, was drafted into the Vietnam War and did serve in Vietnam, and so has a relationship with war, or feelings about war. And so I think that there is kind of an authorial kind of voice that is evident in the composition of objects here, that you don't see it if you're just kind of seeing it as a mess of things that don't really go together. So in this section of the car, he's amassed a bunch of grenades and other instruments of war and death. And then this is a detail from just above where the grenades are, and these are shooting medals that he's collected and assembled here. So again, he is saying something about violence and death, I believe, here. And this is another detail of the side of the car where he seems to be emphasizing this theme of death and violence and war. And then on the other side of the car are very different sorts of objects, including this funny and rather eerie collection of babies' shoes and lots of other emblems of femininity and motherhood, I think, including these sort of 1960s hair rollers on the left. And you'll see there are several images of the Virgin Mary collected on this side of the car. So in this juxtaposition of war objects and domestic objects, there's an intentionality and sort of a storytelling being done by Best that is interesting. I see a question in the chat asking if the car was ever meant to be driven, and it is a working car. And I learned from speaking to Jose here this morning that Rene himself did frequently drive the car around the property and often drove it out to get his mail on Sonoma Highway. But I don't believe it was ever driven much outside of the property because it was conceived and commissioned to be part of the art collection. My research showed that David Best, when he received this commission from Rene, had a little bit of a tortured feeling about it because he didn't believe that, he didn't really believe in participating in the commercial art market and wasn't really interested in selling his work to wealthy collectors. So Best struggled with this commission, but eventually decided to do it. And the reasoning that he stated in this interview I was reading with him was that what he really likes about doing the cars and the value that he sees in them is not so much monetary value, but it's about the community of people that is required to make a car like this. So he said that over the course of his career making art cars, he has worked with like over 10,000 people from all walks of life that collaborate with him on making these cars. So for the Exploratorium car that he was the first one he ever did, he worked with developmentally disabled people to create the car. And in this case, he worked with school children from Napa to create the car. So in Best's view, the value of these works is not monetary or, but rather the car has sort of a social value because it's a vehicle for him to teach skills like welding and technical skills to the kinds of underserved populations that he brings in to work with him on these cars. So that's how he justified accepting the commission from Rene. to create the car. But I think he must have sort of a bedeviled attitude about the fact that it's now this valuable thing that sits in a private collection that people need to pay to come and view, because that is really antithetical to his sense of morality and his artistic values, from what I can tell. Okay. This is another great detail that shows these police helicopters. So again, this sort of symbology of like state violence, I guess, is something that pops up again and again in the kind of artifacts that he has chosen to assemble here. This image, I think, is really interesting, and because it's kind of like a visual joke, kind of along the lines of something you might see in a Wiley piece, I think, because you see there are ships that are kind of sailing on a sea of things that say drier. So it's a visual joke, you see? And so that's an example of all kinds of little kind of really almost Wiley-esque little word plays and puns that you can see if you look really closely at how he has composed the assembled objects. So that connection to Wiley was kind of a revelation for me when I thought of that in preparation for tonight. I think that's really interesting. I see a question in my chat. Oh, he still lives and works he has a compound on Sonoma Mountain, which I learned he was originally purchased by those abstract expressionists from the California School of Fine Arts, including Hansel and Still, that his piece of property on Sonoma Mountain was originally an artist's colony for the abstract expressionist painters that taught at the California School of Fine Arts. So he kind of sees himself as extending that mission on the land by inviting all kinds of people there to collaborate with him on the cars as well as on the temples, which is better known now. Okay, but so I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to just say a few more words about how I think it's fruitful to think about David Best as part of kind of the wider universe of the San Francisco art scene in the 60s and 70s, because there are a couple of ways that he's really connected to the other artists in the collection that I think aren't immediately obvious. Okay, so one thing that connects him to artists like Bruce Conner is that much like Bruce Conner, he's doing assemblage sculptures using discarded materials. So that was just exactly what Bruce Conner set out in his manifesto for the Rat Bastard Protection Society. He said that he wanted to create a collective of artists who would create work from the detritus of society. And so Conner and Brown and a lot of the people that hung around them were really interested in this idea of kind of using discarded trash to create assemblage sculptures. So in some ways, Best is really, with this card, is kind of extending that program. And an interesting thing about Conner's program was that he believed that even discarded sort of garbage materials that didn't have any inherent monetary value still had aesthetic value that you could only find by working with them. So this is a video that I found of him talking a little bit. So I'm just going to play a few short clips that kind of where you can hear him in his own words, kind of reflecting some of this Bruce Conner style ethos.
So we kind of match them up, right? Right. So that's what we want to do. I don't strive for perfection. I like mistakes.
Yes. Okay, so if we clamp this and then we can bend it out.
The material has its own personality, and it's going to do what it's gonna do. Even this stuff, it's got its own nature, right? You know, if you look at it long enough, you'll start to find out where it works.
That thing there about if you work with the discarded material long enough, you're gonna like kind of learn its sensual qualities and figure out how it works and how they work together. And that's like pure Bruce Conner. And also like Bruce Conner, I think there's kind of an anti-consumerist like politics that is at work behind this art making strategy. So it was also a political stance for both Conner and Best to say that they were going to make art objects from the detritus of society. And so I wanted to point out that this kind of political stance against consumerism and I guess capitalism more broadly is another important kind of connection point between Best and a lot of the other artists that we associate with the Bay Area art scene in the 60s and 70s. And then another, and then thinking about his sort of distaste for consumerism is another, I think, interesting thing to think about when you're looking at the car, because in some ways it's really like a dramatization and like a making visible of the kind of gross culture of like American waste, you know? And yeah, and he kind of is making visible like the connection between the problematic nature of American consumerism and how that's connected to sort of death and destruction and war. And that the car really kind of, yeah, makes that visible. So he really shares a lot of interests and also strategies and practices with Bruce Conner and the circle around Conner in the 50s. And then just another thing quickly that I found in my research that was really interesting is that he also studied under Wally Hedrick and Jay DeFeo at the Art Institute, and he really looked up to both of them, and especially Jay DeFeo. And he described in this interview I read going to parties at the Fillmore House when Jay DeFeo was working on the Rose, and he spoke really, really reverentially about the Rose and about how it was such a kooky thing for DeFeo to be doing, and that she was kind of a mad woman creating this crazy, thick painting that kind of defied all of the aesthetic dictates of the art market. And she was making a thing that she knew could never be sold in a gallery. And the kind of madness of that proposition and the sort of really incorrect nature of that really inspired him and appealed to him. So like DeFeo making the Rose, I think he is intentionally making things that are kind of ugly or a little bit aesthetically offensive to somebody who is really well versed in contemporary art, you know. So like a DeFeo or a Conner, he's really thumbing his nose at what gallerists or curators in museums would deem to be correct aesthetically. So he is part and parcel of what some have called the funk movement, I guess, in that way too. And the rest of this video, I guess I lost it. I won't, but and so just to put a final point on that, that I think this thing about how he believes that the value of his art projects are not, that his works are valuable not because of how much money they can bring in, but because of the communities that he can build around the making. And he's really interested in cultivating creative communities. That really reflects to me too some of the important values of the sort of incorrect art world in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. This like rejection of the art market and of the idea that art should be about monetary worth. And because I think that's really, really central to what made the Bay Area a uniquely kind of incorrect place to be an artist in the 60s and 70s. And that also, I think, illuminates the whole deal with his temples at Burning Man, you know, the fact that he builds these elaborate structures with the intention of burning them to the ground so that they can't be consumed by connoisseurs or gallerists is really interesting if you think about it in the context of this sort of larger sweep of Bay Area art history. And that, yeah, it really, a lot of the artists that are in the collection were in a similar way kind of thumbing their nose at the art market and creating things that weren't intended ever to be consumed by connoisseurs and gallerists and curators. And that I think is the really distinctive thing about the Bay Area art scene. And in the 60s and 70s, especially, there wasn't a booming art market in the Bay Area. So that's a really big part of what made the Bay Area an attractive place for these incorrect kind of renegade artists that had a kind of political and moral kind of opposition to the way that the art market had manifested in New York, where art was just created to be consumed by wealthy people.
Twyla, that helps explain even Burning Man,
Yeah,
which is all about build it and then destroy it. It's not
Exactly.
meant to be kept.
exactly.
Although I must say his temples are gorgeous. They're not found art. They're not, assembled beautifully designed temples.
Right.
But the art cars at Burning Man nowadays, they're not like his art cars at all. They are totally consumerist. Loud music, flashing lights, flames, showing that you've got more music power than the other guy. So there's kind of a divergence there as well. But I've only been to a couple of Burning Man events and only one burning of the temple, and it was amazing. At Burning Man the night before, it's all noisy and raucous and colors and lights. And at the Memorial Temple, everybody sits down, lights out, and is quiet and thoughtful.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like Burning Man, like the San Francisco art scene, has maybe since the 90s or something, has become more consumerist and neoliberal and capitalistic.
Well, yeah, if what you really want to do is take a lot of drugs, you got to have a lot of music and a lot of light for it.
Right. But it's really interesting to think about Burning Man as kind of an outgrowth of the unique creative communities in the Bay Area.
Right. It still is a lot about creative communities doing stuff. I worked on an art car and there were a lot of people helping on it. So there's
Right.
still a lot of that, but not as much as I think David would like to see.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Thanks for the Bruce Connor connection. That was good.
Good. Yeah, it's so similar.
If I could just make a quick comment. So I'm Hugo. I work at Through Us as well. And I do our social media and I check the messages that come in. And a couple of weeks ago, somebody had posted a close-up picture of the art car and I didn't recognize it. I totally thought that they were just, because sometimes people tag just random people to try to get more traffic to their page. So I saw this, the skulls and the grenades. I was like, what is this? I didn't even recognize it because, it's easy to miss all these things. But now that we've spent more time looking at it, it's really great to identify all these little kind of nooks and crannies.
Yeah. And like the thing I said about all the visual jokes and kind of like the visual punning that's happening in almost kind of a wily way, and that it's also like wily, it's both serious and funny at the same time. Were you going to say something, Wayne?
Just that when I think of a rhinoceros, besides the fact that it's poached all the time for its horn, it's a very scary animal.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be much more aggressive and militaristic than most other animals.
Yeah.
All the military stuff on it, all the violent stuff on it makes some sense.
Yeah. The thing about rhinos being the target of poaching too is kind of interesting though too, in terms of the conversation about monetizing beautiful things and yeah, creating beautiful objects, but that from commercializing beautiful things is involved with like death and destruction or something. That makes sense. But yeah, I think definitely just as a final thought, I know I just said this, but how, like so many other works in the collection, it's really towing the line between being funny and silly and being serious in a way that isn't very obvious, I think, when you just initially look at it. So I guess we should encourage everybody to read it much more closely than they do. And really look at some of the individual objects. Yeah, that's a challenge for us, I think. Okay. Did Jackie have a question? No. Okay. Well, I'm very grateful to you all for bearing with me through this entire series. I've enjoyed it very much. And I think in the future, it would be great to open this up and hear some of you all give similar talks about individual artworks, because I think it's so fruitful to spend time really closely looking at individual works like this. And I would love to hear a wider variety of voices and perspectives doing similar work. So I think that's something we should work towards. And yeah, we can still include cocktails in the future. Okay, so stay posted, keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.